middle of a raise, so we know for sure that at least 100 people, hopefully more, will be giving at least $500 a month for 18 months starting in February.
Okay.
In addition to that, there'll be a control group of about 200 to 300 people who will be compensated for filling out surveys and stuff, but won't get the same benefit. So there's some level of comparison.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So I want to get you, Chris, also involved in the conversation. So I know you were very intimately involved in the project as well. How did you and Michael first meet? How did this come about?
Well, first off, it's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to be back at the Kennedy School, back at the IOP, and across the street from my old dorm. We started Facebook in Kirkland House, and it's like maybe 200 feet away. So it's nice to be here. I met the mayor through my colleague Natalie. So Natalie Foster and I run this organization called the Economic Security Project. And by way of introduction to explain how we decided to get behind the mayor and get behind his vision for a guaranteed income pilot in Stockton, I can give some context on what we do. So in my view and the Economic Security Project's view, our economy is fundamentally broken. It is not a popular time to say that sentence because if you read the news, the stock market is super high. Corporate profits are literally at record highs. They've got so much money, they don't know what to do with it, so they're spending it all buying back shares, largely as a result of the Trump tax bill. And so there's, in many pockets of the United States, a sense the economy is doing great. What's the problem? When in reality, what we know is happening underneath the surface is that median wages for working Americans are flat. I'll say that again. Median wages for Americans are flat. Folks make the same amount of money that they made about in 1976, about 40, 50 years ago. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate is technically low, but there are so many people who are part of the gig economy, part-time work, contract work. The nature of work in the United States is becoming increasingly unstable. So you could probably find a job of some sort, but it's increasingly less likely that it's going to provide you any kind of financial security. One other data point is that in the past 10 years, according to Alan Kruger and other Princeton economists, since the recession, effectively all of the jobs that have been created in the United States have been either part-time, contract, or contingent. In other words, they don't provide you the stability that a 40-hour-a-week job provides. And at the same time, the cost of housing, up and to the right. Cost of education, up and to the right. Student debt, as probably many of you know or are learning quickly, is at catastrophic levels. So something is fundamentally not working in the economy, and we believe you have to rewrite the rules of the economy to make it work for everyone. We've done that for most of American history. It's only in the past 40 years, with the rise of neoliberal economics, the rise of Ronald Reagan, and a whole set of politics that came with it, that we've gotten off track. We can get back on track. So our theory is, and the reason that we decided to work with the mayor, is that first and most importantly, we need to support an emerging generation of leaders who are making the case for big ideas that really should be conventional wisdom. So the mayor and my colleague Natalie met. He talked with her about his experience reading Dr. King. He's now the mayor of Stockton, wanted to do something ambitious and bold. And Natalie and I were both really taken aback by the ability for somebody in a position of real authority to take such a, what the conventional wisdom would say is a risky decision to, push forward on a relatively controversial idea, and with such confidence, and can I use the word grace? I'll say grace too, that it resets the whole playing field. So the opportunity is, of course, to provide 100 people with a guaranteed income, but what's more, it's to start a whole conversation about how our economy should work, how the economy of Stockton should work, how the economy of California should work, and how the economy in general in the United States should work. And I hope that the fundamental foundation or the cornerstone of that conversation is the simple idea that if you're working in some way in America, if you're doing something to improve your life or the lives of others in your community, you should not live in poverty. And we know how to lift people out of it, It's a lot simpler than you think. Cash can do it, and we just have to build the political will and cultivate more leaders like Mayor Tubbs who are convening that conversation in the first place.
Okay. Well, I guess I want to pick up on a little bit about what you were talking about, this idea that cash can do it. Because a lot of activists, a lot of people in philanthropy have gone into different topic areas, ranging from health to economic development, to migration and immigration issues. So why cash? Like, why did you settle upon this idea of cash? How did you come to it?
So my story and the way that I got to cash actually goes through Harvard and Facebook and all of these things. So I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of it to answer your question. So I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, Hickory, North Carolina. It's the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Mom was a public school teacher. Dad was a traveling paper salesman. Just as middle class you come. I got financial aid, effectively a full ride to go to a fancy boarding school and then to come here to Harvard where I was on financial aid. We started Facebook across the street in 2004, and Mark and Dustin, because they had economic security, could take the risky decision to drop out, which is what they did. I did not. I stayed in. I was the first in my family to ever end up at a place like Harvard. The last thing I'm going to do, I didn't want to go home and tell my mom, guess what, I'm dropping out. That wouldn't have gone over that well. And it wasn't what I wanted either. Facebook obviously took off like a rocket ship, and that is history and not the subject of tonight's conversation, but it radically changed my life in a relatively short period of time. And I made a lot of money for a pretty modest amount of work, and in a way that I think exposes the unfairness that lurks underneath the economy. Like a lot of people would say, oh, look at people like me, I'm like the American dream, right? Like didn't come from much, but then, went to Harvard, made all this money. That's the way America's supposed to work. In my view, it's really exactly the opposite. Like no one is supposed to make $500 million for 3 years worth of work. That is not the way I want our economy to work. I don't think that's the way most Americans want our economy to work. And the reality, though, is that we have structured the economy to make my case may be extreme, but it's not that uncommon. Income inequality and wealth inequality in the United States is at historic proportions, worse than it was in the Gilded Age, even over 100 years ago. So the reason I'm saying all that is because as I came into all this money, my husband and I made a commitment to give away the vast majority, all the money in the course of our lifetimes. So we began a philanthropic journey to ask the question, okay, well, how can you help people most effectively that A, respects their freedom and dignity to make decisions for themselves, and B, doesn't just, fund the philanthropic ecosystem just for the sake of it. And what you end up with what I ended up with after all this journey is that cash has both a moral reason and an empirical reason. The moral reason is I don't think there's any way to respect the dignity and freedom of anyone more so than saying, here is money, you decide. If you want to spend it on housing, you want to spend it on healthcare, you want to go have a nice dinner because you're stressed and you haven't been able to treat your kid to something in weeks, go for it. I think that there's a fundamental belief I have that it respects that. And then secondly, it's also incredibly well researched. When you give people money, we generally know that people spend it smartly. They spend it on outcomes that are positive for their families. Their kids do better in school. They're a little bit less stressed. They go to the hospital less often. And overall, it boosts economic opportunity. They work just as much as they did before, if not more. So it's a long-winded way of saying I arrived at cash because I believe in it from a values perspective, and also because the evidence base is actually quite robust. What's still missing is that third piece is developing the political will so that people believe it's possible, doable, and desirable to create an income floor for the people who need it most.
Okay. So I agree with you completely on the evidence base, and as somebody who works on...
You're the economist.
Well, I'm the economist, and so I'm a little bit connected, but also removed because I work on a lot of cash transfer programs and a lot of safety net programs, but in developing countries. And I must say, I understand the enormity of what you're doing in terms of trying to put together this pilot and how difficult it is to get them off the ground, having done it myself. And so I wanted to know a little bit from you, what are the biggest challenges you faced in terms of trying to get this started?
Well, I think the first challenge was my own biases. I think I came in interested in studying the idea, but not really an advocate or a believer. I actually was much more likely to support something like a jobs guarantee, or something like that. But then over the course of a year and spend in living rooms and listening to people, found just a couple of things and I think it's helped kind of have the conversation in the city is why it's a good thing. And the first thing was that finances are so inherently personal that I could talk to 100 people and get 100 different answers for what $500 a month would mean, and they all made sense to me when I heard them. Like, oh yeah, I see why you would want to do that. You're smart enough to understand the best way to use $500 for yourself. Number two, it's also realizing that a lot of folks who are poor do work. Like 44%, I think, of all poor people work full time. And the vast majority of poor people who don't work are children. And we have child labor laws, which means they can't work, right? But I didn't realize that until getting knee deep in this. And then once I got the confidence of myself to say, you know what, it's a risk, but I would argue as a mayor, if you can't take a risk on the people you represent, then what's the point of having the job, right? So then it became, how do I make the argument to everyone else, to my friends in the faith community, to my folks in the business community, and to other folks who are struggling? Because what has also been interesting is how much in this kind of hegemonic idea around this Protestant work ethic that a lot of times folks who are struggling hate, dislike, or distrust other folks who are struggling. And the conversations I had with folks who are one paycheck away from deprivation saying, we don't deserve anything. So really, the challenge has been reshaping the conversation as to this is not a handout, but this is part of what we get as part of our commons, as part of being a citizen of Stockton. You're eligible for this, not because you need anything, but this is what you get for being a citizen of the city, and kind of bringing that idea of commons back has been a big challenge.
Okay. So what in the end, with this pilot, what are you going to view as success? If we came and did this forum again in 2 years, 2.5 years, what would you view as success?
I'm going to answer it and not answer it. I think that in many respects, success is actually doing this pilot, like doing this demonstration, because I come in, I have a point of view. I think I know what happens, but I think just being able to point to something that happened is success, because I can't do that currently, at least domestically in the last couple of years, aside from Alaska. Number two, success would be if 320,000 people of Stockton come storming City Hall and say, this program worked so well for these 100 families, figure out how to scale it. And I'll take them to the Capitol. Tell them to figure out how to scale it. They'll take it to DC. That would be success. And then number three, just being able to answer really fundamental questions. Number one, what's the money spent on? Number two, what impact does it have on health, stress, anxiety? And then the last thing that would be success for me is, and I think we're doing some of the work thanks to not just what we're doing, but the work of Economic Security Project, Chris's book, other folks nationally, is just really just to reframe the conversation. So that dignity is not attached to work, but dignity is attached to humanity. Like I have dignity because I'm a person, not because I'm working myself to death. Poor people aren't bad. Like poverty's bad, but the folks in poverty aren't bad. They actually work incredibly hard and are good and have inherent value. Just being able to have a conversation like that that's rooted in a place like Stockton for me is really special.
Oh, that's great. What about you, Chris? Would you agree?
Well, I think we're already seeing, I was in Stockton 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and, this was, it had been maybe 6 or 9 months since I had been there, and the thing that I was struck by the most in the conversations was how permeating this idea has already become. And not just among like civil society leaders and political leaders and like whatever, the Stockton hoi polloi, but we spent time, some of my colleagues and I spent time in a public housing development where people came to talk to us about the state of the economy. They were not told exactly what was on the agenda to talk about, and so we just asked questions like, oh, have you heard about this demonstration? Have you heard about the idea of a guaranteed income? Yeah, I've heard about that. Had you heard about it 6 months ago? No, I had no idea what it is. Well, what do you think about it? Well, I think the economy isn't working for most of us. I think it's generally a good idea. How do I sign up? Now, it sounds so obvious that people would say something like, how do I sign up? But I've done a lot of conversations like this. And let me tell you, you can test it with your Lyft driver tonight, or, choose whoever is your random focus group of one. Oftentimes, that isn't what people say. They actually say, what are you talking about? What do you mean money for nothing? Like, why would anyone get that? People work, you get paid. That's the point of minimum wage laws. Like, this is how it works. And oftentimes it takes time to explain that this is actually an old idea. Conservative economists like Milton Friedman and all kinds of folks like that have been supportive of it. And it's basically the idea of social insurance through cash, a foundation. And it takes time. My point is, sometimes it takes time for people to understand what this idea is. So my definition of success is multiple and varied, but specifically one piece of it is to have an entire city, one of the nation's largest cities of hundreds of thousands of people, where people have, not just learned what the concept is, but understand that it's possible, it's doable, and could really be transformative. So if we can do that in Stockton, then it suggests to me we can do that at state level, and if we can do it at a state, then I think we can do it in the United States in the long term.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you say that, because it is a very old idea, and it's an idea that has taken off in actually many of the developing countries I work in. Cash transfers are one of the biggest anti-poverty programs there are. So it's interesting now to see that this discussion is starting to happen now in the US as well. Okay, so then now I'm going to get to, before we open it up in a few minutes, I'm going to get to some of the more complicated questions.
So what was that before?
Oh, that was me being nice. No, so now I want to get a little bit more into the meat of what you're doing and ask a little bit about, well, the ideas that the critics would raise. And I think the first one I wanted to talk about was this idea that, in the pilot study you're doing, you're really focusing on one side of the public economics question. You're just focusing on the cash side and not what happens on the taxation side that needs to pay for the transfers. How would you respond to critics that say you're missing part of the picture?
My response is simple. There's no way one mayor at 28 years old can answer all these questions by himself. So I'm doing my part. I'm answering this half of the equation. I think it's up to other folks in other cities and other people who also live in this country and care about the economic system to answer some of those other questions. I know Economic Security Project is doing some of that work with Eitc extensions and stuff, and we're part of those discussions, but we're taking the lead on the direct cash transfer and kind of measuring that, doing a good job with that. But for sure, I don't think it's a panacea. I don't think it replaces all the other things. I think Chris and I both say folks need good schools, health care, affordable housing. Like all those, none of those things are competitive to me. I think they're all necessary.
But I guess that gets back to my second question I was going to ask about, because for many people, they often think about it's a choice between giving out cash and a basic income versus actually developing government systems that could provide public goods. And you were saying you don't see them in competition in terms of, or...
No, we must, I would say we must have both. I think that, you could imagine all kinds of scenarios where you have a guaranteed income, and if you don't have a smart wage policy, then a good portion of it would get eaten up as subsidies for low-wage employers. Or if you don't have a good housing policy, a good portion of it would be get eaten up in rent to landlords. Or if you don't have a competitive marketplace, as I argue, concentration of corporate power today is an enormous problem. If we don't do something about that and reinvigorate antitrust and have a more robust pro-competition policy, then in the same vein, you would not necessarily accomplish the goals that you would set out with. So I think we've got to do all of these things at once, and I refuse the logic that we've got to choose. And I find that particularly when it comes to cash, it's most powerful when it's in conjunction with a lot of these kinds of these economic policies. To your previous point about how to pay for it, I want to be really specific about what I talk about when I talk about a guaranteed income. This is a little bit different than a UBI. I think most folks here, given I'm seeing a lot of nodding, are somewhat familiar. So the idea of a UBI is $1,000 to every American roughly every month. A guaranteed income is really an income floor to stabilize the lives of people who need it most. It could be $500 a month. The amount doesn't matter, but you could think of it as a kind of negative income tax or a kind of expansion to stabilize the lives of the poor and the lower middle class, which is different. The reason that I want to bring that up is because it really matters on cost.
Yeah.
If you're giving every American $1,000 every month, including Bill Gates, it's going to cost trillions and trillions of dollars. It's going to dwarf the entirety of the federal budget. If you're instead saying for every family in America who makes less than $50,000, we're going to provide you $500 a month, roughly, to help you make ends meet. It's still expensive. It's on the order of magnitude of $300 billion a year, but it is very much doable. I mean, over a 10-year period, it's roughly the same cost of what the Trump tax bill cost that was passed last year. So structure matters when it comes to affordability, and I think it's important not to lose sight of that, but it's really important not to say, oh, well, that's just too expensive. There's no way we could ever do that. It's just a question of developing the political will.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, those were my questions, and so I wanted to open it up to the crowd. I think I've been told that the forum works that you have to identify yourself when you ask a question, and we'll have mics come around. The second thing is, please restrict yourself to one brief question, and no speeches. So just come on up.
So questions that end in a question mark.
Questions that end with a question mark, exactly.
That's a good way of saying
And
it.
so should we take a few questions, or do you want to answer them one by one?
However.
Okay, let's take a few questions then. Maybe let's take 3 of them.
More efficient.
Yeah.
Hi, Kiana. I'm from Canada. I'm a first year at the college. I'm really excited personally to see where this pilot goes. I was wondering, as you both anticipate the Stockton pilot to launch, what are you most worried about that could go wrong, or what do you anticipate could be the biggest obstacles?
Okay, let's take a second question as well.
Sure, my name is Lenny. I have no Harvard affiliation, just general public. But one of the proposals that's been gaining momentum recently is the carbon tax and dividend proposal that would provide a universal carbon dividend to every family in America. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. I know that Exxon just announced either today or yesterday that they're committing $1 million to a C4 to advocate for it, not against it.
Okay,
Really?
these are good questions. Why don't we start with these 2, and then we'll collect a few more.
So and I'm the face, but I have like a staff that actually has to do all the logistical work on this. So that's probably, I think it's going to be perfect. I think it's going to work well. But I think my biggest fear would be that somehow, given the amount of media attention, that a recipient is unduly harmed, like with no malice, but something like something unfortunate happens, like they're targeted or I don't know. That would be my biggest fear, number 1. And number 2, if we've done all this great work, narrative and build up and get to the point, and then something stupid happens, like 1 month, like the disbursement doesn't happen, or something like that. Those are probably my 2 biggest fears. But they're not going to happen. But if I had to have a fear, those would be the 2.
Well, your staff is putting in a lot of work to ensure they don't happen. So.
It's not going to happen.
On the carbon dividend, so this idea really is gaining steam. I think if Hillary Clinton were president, this would have been a really active area of debate because it intersects. It's the place where climate policy intersects with economic policy. For those of you who don't know what it is, the idea is that we put a fee on carbon emissions, a tax on carbon emissions, in order to disincentivize their production. And importantly, we distribute the revenue from that tax as a dividend to every American. So we already do this, sort of, in Alaska. It's not exactly on carbon emissions, but in Alaska, what they do is they allow oil and gas, and a Republican governor back in the 70s said that we're going to allow oil and gas companies to come in, but they have to pay a small fee, and we're going to put it in a public savings jar. And each year, we're going to distribute some of the interest on this to every single Alaskan. So every year in Alaska, just by nature of being a resident there, you get roughly $2,500 So if you're a family of 4, you're making some real money. Your household income is the median is around 60 grand. So that's a real boost to your bottom line that's coming once a year. So it's a very proven model. People in Alaska love it, even though it's a purple state. It's very popular. And importantly, in a national setting, if you were to do it with a tax on carbon, it would offset the increase of everything from gas at the pump to airline tickets, et cetera, for the people who need it the most. So you would see wealthy people paying more of it, and poor and lower middle class people made whole, and then in some designs getting more. So it's an idea that is gaining a lot of steam, not just on the left, but in the center. I don't think it's going to happen in Trump's America. But I do think it is an idea that will continue to percolate. One other quick thing on that is there are also lots of other ways to fund the piggy bank. You could do a financial transactions tax. You could do a wealth tax. You could do all kinds of other taxes if you wanted to create a savings fund that people could take advantage of.
And really quickly, what really excites me about things like the carbon dividend tax is, again, this idea of kind of the commons. Like, this is what you get not because you're poor, not because you're this, but this is what you get because you're American, and this because it's publicly generated. So.
Great. Okay. So we'll take 2 questions on this side.
I'm Jalen Parnell, so I'm a student at the Ed School and a second-generation Stockton native.
Awesome.
And so I'm just wondering about how a program
Wait,
like
are you coming back to Stockton after you get this Harvard degree?
that's what I'm about to ask you about.
Why you gotta interrupt?
So I'm wondering about, is there an initiative to bring young people back to Stockton? Is that a priority with the guaranteed income? Is that something that y'all are thinking about?
So not necessarily with the guaranteed income, but I think not just myself. So on the school board, we have a gentleman who will actually be speaking at the Harvard Forum Friday, Lang Luntow, who's Stockton native, Harvard grad, came back. So we have a group called the Boomerangs, where we go through and look at the Pinnacle Awards, so the top 30, 40 students in Stockton for the past 10 years, and we creepily send them messages on LinkedIn or Facebook and say, hey, come back. And we've seen people come back from doing that. And then on the policy level, we started a program called Stockton Scholars. So now starting this year, every senior who graduates from high school is guaranteed a scholarship. And part of this is, again, this idea of the commons, and that we're trying to guilt these students to come back and say, look, you got this scholarship for nothing else but you live in Stockton. You have a responsibility to come back and do something if you want to. So those are 2 of the things we're doing now to make sure folks know that when they come back, not just come back, but come back and contribute, and there's work to be done. So I'll be looking for you.
You should tell a story about your mom.
Which one?
What she said when you told her you were coming back to Stockton.
Oh, yeah. So it's funny because 6 years ago when I told my mom I was coming back to Stockton, she was like, hell no, why? You're not coming back, don't do it. And then when I was told I was going to run for mayor, she's like, no, don't do it, don't do it. But now because there's term limits, she's like, okay, if you're going to run again in 2020, that's fine, you only have 4 more years. So I'm trying to get her on board, because I think once I get her advocating for folks to come back, that's game changing for the city.
That's great. Okay, we'll take 2 questions here.
Hi, I'm Alex Howlett. I host a weekly basic income discussion group here in Cambridge, and tomorrow we're going to be talking about you guys. So I've noticed that both of you have kind of tried to distinguish what you're doing from a universal basic income. Like, there's important key differences that you both have cited. So my question is just, what do you think about universal basic income, and do you support it?
It's a great question.
Let's take one more, and then we'll another one.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm at the med school. My question was, assuming the pilot goes well, what are the next steps for scaling it nationally?
Okay.
So I'll take the first one first.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely supportive of a basic income universally. I haven't done as much of the economic analysis as Chris. I think for me, I start at a guaranteed income, just being pragmatic and thinking, if we can't get everyone, I want to help the people who need it most first as a starting point, and that's why I'm so aggressively focused on this guaranteed income. But I do think once we get there, there's space and room to talk about a universal basic income. But I'll also say that's also why things like carbon tax and things are so interesting to me, because I think that's a way we could get to a universal sort of basic thing a lot quicker.
And I would say similar things. I think of UBI as really a theory and not a policy. And by that I mean the theory is no one should live in poverty. We should use cash to prevent it. And it's so simple that it sounds like almost comic, but it is not, the conventional wisdom in America today. And so I think that the increase in interest in UBI, I have real issues with the automation frame, that the robots are going to come take the jobs. I'm sort of, I don't actually think that's true. That's not yet in the economic data. Maybe it is, maybe I'm wrong. We could have a debate with Elon Musk about this, and it's like a fun dinner party topic, but I find it to be distracting from the reality of what's actually happening in America today. Jobs are already coming apart, so we don't need to talk about the effects of Tesla to know that we need an income floor today. So because I think of UBI really as a theory and a set of values, it's to me possible to think about all the different ways of getting it done inside of it. Modernizing the tax code, which is what I work on a lot of the time, a carbon dividend. You could do a child tax credit or a child allowance. There are a lot of different ways. Even a job guarantee of sorts is a kind of guaranteed income. It's just conditional. It's tied to a public job. So, you get to these challenges of where does the definition sort of start to come apart, but I think that the theory that no one should live in poverty and we should use cash as a way to guarantee that is really what a UBI is about, and that's something I think we all should agree to.
Right. I think there was a second question on
on
scaling
scalability.
up.
Yeah, I work on the scalability all the time. I do think, I will make the case that I think the easiest way to create an income floor in the United States is through the tax code. So, I'm going to geek out for like 30 seconds. We actually have the largest cash transfer program in the world already. It's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. $70 billion. 30 million American families get it every single year. And what it is it's a check in the mail with no strings attached. We're already providing tens of millions of Americans with cash. It's a refundable tax credit, so it means that even if you didn't pay any income tax, you still are able to draw down the benefit. If you expand that significantly, make it monthly, and also broaden the definition of work to include untraditional work like childcare, elder care, or students, what you end up with is something that looks and is effectively a kind of income floor. We can do this at a state level, and we can do it federally. And so when we talk about scaling and what's the next step, it's creating a working families tax credit, a modernized and earned income tax credit in the state of California and nationally. And what we would end up with is effectively the same kinds of policies that the team in Stockton is piloting.
And the only thing I would add to that, I think to your question, it's really a question of democracy, in that I can run all the pilots and do all the good things in Stockton, but it's going to take a groundswell of folks saying, you know what, in the richest country on the earth, there should be economic floor. That we've been talking about this for the past 200 plus years as a union, and now it's time to make it happen. So happy to be the demonstration side and be kind of first movers, but it's going to really take a groundswell of folks from throughout the nation to say, it's not just a Stockton thing, but everyone throughout this country deserves at least an income floor, and we need to figure out how to pay for it.
Great. Why don't we take two questions from the side?
Jared Johnson. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. So my question is, there are a lot of people in America who their vision of the American dream is very much based in having a job, and it's hard for them to decouple that identity and sense of pride and purpose in having a job. How do you have the conversation with that person who maybe feels that way to the point where they would even refuse the help of something that's trying to give them a minimum income?
Okay. Let's get one more.
My name is Christopher Lucy, not a student here, but would massive new tax programs harm the economy, and how does this help the dysfunctional who are mired in poverty and they're not really part of the economy? Because the people you describe as giving this welfare subsidy to would be people who actually work or they're already engaged in the economy, and the poverty I see around where I live is people who are not fit to work or don't have any skills to offer or nothing that they can use to be productive in the economy.
That's a follow-up question. Are those folks disabled, or when you say they don't So like sick.
cause them to be not part of the functioning labor force.
Mm.
They might be able to with a lot of rehabilitation, but very often they're not.
Mm.
Right, those are two good questions.
So let me make sure I understood the first question. The first question is, how do you explain this benefit to folks who really derive a sense of purpose from work?
Yeah, people who have a sense of pride and purpose from their work and the idea of having work, even if they don't have work, to where they might want to refuse help because for them, they'd say, I want a job, I don't want a free check.
Yeah, well, I would say I don't think those things are mutually exclusive, and I don't think a basic income is saying don't work. It's saying, for whatever reasons, people are working and working incredibly hard, but still can't pay for basic necessities, and that's an issue, right? Number two, I would also, well, I think, and it's been a really journey over the past year, but just understanding basic income from a feminist lens, and that there's all type of people, mostly women, who do work that's not considered work. It's not a job, but they're caregivers, they're taking care of sick family members, they're raising kids, etc. And I would argue they deserve some sort of compensation for the amount of work they're putting in. So I think it's a conversation to have, and I'm not sure in practicality I have ever met anyone. They may say something, but if I gave them a check with no explanation, they would reject it. No matter, hell, I know rich people who, if I gave them a check, wouldn't reject it.
I have so many thoughts on this. I think that there is this lurking narrative that's about work that's directly connected to race in the United States. And it specifically goes like there are hardworking people who are trying hard to make ends meet, and we often invoke assembly lines and like white blue collar folks from like Ohio to be like the real hardworking Americans. And what lurks just behind that is the specter of Ronald Reagan's welfare queen. The idea specifically that people of color and women are really just out to like hang out and not be meaningful participants in the economy. Now, what we actually know is that labor force participation amongst black women is higher than it is in America today than white men. So let's just establish that all of that is wrong. Empirically, it is incorrect, not to mention the fact that black women have unique challenges that white men don't in order to secure and hold on to employment in the first place. At the same time as all of that is happening below the surface, there is this obsession with work, though, that crosses race, that crosses class, that crosses a lot of boundaries in America, because it is tied to a sense of virtue and a sense that, like, I want to be of purpose to my community. And so I fall out on the side that says that actually work is pretty important. I don't want to live in a future where the robots have taken all of the jobs. I think that work is like, you know, I mean, let's be honest, for myself, I don't have to work. Do I work every day? Yeah, I do. I have the privilege of working on something that I think is really important, but I work because it gives me a sense of purpose. And I think most Americans of all races, of all classes, of all backgrounds want that. So I think that work is used often cynically to do this thing, to designate deserving and undeserving. And at the same time, it's actually something that the vast majority of Americans actually want to have and want to feel. So that's why when I talk about a guaranteed income, I don't talk about it as a replacement for work, because I don't think that that's what will happen. We also know from the labor studies when we did some pilots in the US in the 70s that people didn't really drop out of the workforce. I do, however, say that if you're working, if you're doing something, you shouldn't live in poverty. And really, no one should live in poverty. It's just that I think that with the exception of the disabled, or with the exception of the addicted or the mentally ill, Americans are working, and Americans also deserve to have economic security. So that's at least how I approach that. I did write a book in the winter of last year where I have a couple chapters just on these questions, and to be honest, they were some of the hardest questions for me to write because there were so many different threads to untangle, but where I ended up is believing that work is important, people want to work, and we should recognize that and make sure that people can make ends meet no matter what.
And just to draw on Chris's point a little bit, I think oftentimes, at least in the conversations I've had, people have combined work and purpose. And I do think that everyone has a need to feel like purpose, they're adding value. And I think oftentimes we use the word work, as Chris said, to describe that, but I would still argue those two things are different. And that you could have a lot of purpose and not, quote unquote, work, but you're being productive. So it's either, as the point of the book, either broadening the definition of work, or really let's have a conversation about what does purpose mean, and why should purpose be tied to making someone else money, or why does purpose need to be tied to working 14 hours a day and coming home stressed, not seeing your kids. But I think it's a wider conversation we need to have just about values and sort of what type of lives do we want to live as members of this community. And then to the second question, I would say you hit it in your answer. I would, and I appreciate the question, but I would argue that poverty is a dysfunction, right? So I think a lot of dysfunctional behaviors you may see as it's not. I don't think the dysfunction is the cause of poverty. I would argue the poverty is the cause of the dysfunction. And I would also argue that folks who are mentally ill or drug addicted, which is also a form of mental illness, probably need the most robust safety nets and probably need kind of guaranteed incomes the most, because if they have those illnesses, it's oftentimes hard to work to pay for things like housing and food and security, the things folks need to actually get well.
And we do have a guaranteed income in the United States for the disabled. That was one of the things that came out of the last debate in the 70s when Richard Nixon proposed the idea of a guaranteed income for everyone. It's called Social Security Disability Insurance. And you could, it's not quite $1,000 a month, but I think it's woefully, it needs to be much larger in my view. But there is, there is some infrastructure. There's a framework to build upon and improve.
Okay, let's take two from the side.
My name is Kainoa Loman. I'm a freshman here, and I'm actually from Sacramento. So I've been following like the whole Reinvent Stockton campaign for a while. And what I really like about it is that it seems kind of geared towards making people proud and excited to be from Stockton. And I'm sort of wondering if this initiative contributes to that effect, like regardless of whether or not like it proves to be effective in like increasing people's wealth, like whether it's kind of there's a psychological benefit to feeling like the government is taking an active role and doing something exciting, and there's all this buzz around this thing that's happening in the city, and like whether that's like just good for general productivity and for people staying around, and if you've been able to feel that at all.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I think that it's been super interesting because you're from Sacramento, so you know for a long time Stockton has always been defined as a city of problems. So you go to Stockton to see where the problem is, or you go to Stockton to see where you don't want to be. So I think for a lot of us there's a sense of pride that, wow, people are looking at us to see if this is a solution. They're looking to Stockton for answers. So I know as a government official, but also as a Stocktonian, that's something that I'm really proud of. And then number two, you just saw how excited people were when they found out Chris Hughes was Chris Hughes. They're like, Tubbs got Facebook in Stockton, y'all. They want to help us. And it's been really helpful. Literally, like, people get really excited to see that, wow.
I just confused it. Thought Mark Zuckerberg was going to show up pretty soon, next in line.
They were like, wow, we matter, and we're not some forgotten city, some written off city, but now we're at the precipice of a very, very important social question that this nation will be answering over the next decade. So it's definitely hopeful, and it's also part. And then the last thing I would say, especially when I can talk to my residents and saying, look, this is what Chuck Woolery is saying, this is what Sarah Palin is saying, this is what Bill O'Reilly is saying, this is what Breitbart News is saying. I'm taking all this heat because I believe that you're smart enough to spend $500 how you see fit, and just the way it makes people feel proud, like, oh wow, like this is my quote unquote leaders believe in me. So it's been helpful in that way as well.
Thank you.
Great. Let's take one more from here.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a senior at the college. My question is more about the logistics of the actual rollout. I know to scale up an initiative like this, you would probably need pretty robust results, and you guys mentioned working with researchers. So I'm wondering, whether or not you'll be randomizing treatment and something to that extent, and how you'll be selecting the families that are actually affected.
So for all you guys, probably all you guys, because you guys are Harvard, so you guys like geeking out, I heard. So if you go to StocktonDemonstration.org, there's an 18-page paper that lays everything out in detail. In a couple of weeks, there'll be a whole pre-evaluation plan. But to answer your question succinctly, Yes, it'll be randomly. It's an RTC sort of experimental design. So starting next month, 1,000 families who live in neighborhoods at or below the median area income of $46,000 will be given a letter saying, hey, you're eligible to be part of this demonstration. From that, the smart researchers and the smart computer will come up with at least 100 people who fit the demographics that are reflective of the city. And those folks will be the group, and then the experiment group, and then there'll be a parallel group that'll be the control group. And for 18 months, the researchers will be tracking them in parallel, and they'll be giving nothing too invasive, but surveys and focus groups, etc. They'll also be using probably prepaid debit cards or some ways, not to track individually what people are doing, but to track in the aggregate, sort of just kind of where the broad buckets in which money is spent. And then in 18 months, the evaluation, the trial will conclude, the evaluation will happen, and then a year afterwards, we should have a report.
Can I go back to
Yeah.
one thing?
Did that answer your question?
No, you're.
We didn't
happy to
answer
do
the
so.
taxes question.
Yeah.
Well, and we didn't answer your question. You asked it, I know, and I don't want to. I'm worried that it seems like I love that question. I don't want to. I'm not at all.
I thought I answered it.
No, but he asked if the taxes, if we're gonna levy all these taxes, isn't that gonna damage the economy?
Oh, I didn't hear that part.
So, I think the short answer is no, and specifically if the taxes are directed towards the people who need the money most, the spending from that will cause the economy to grow. I have a historical example and then a specific report. Tax rates on the 1%, if you will, on income above $250,000 are really at near historic lows. And to pay for $500 a month to every American who makes 50 grand or less, you need to raise those rates that are roughly around 35% now back up to around 50%. That's where they were for the golden era of American economic growth, when we grew the fastest and when that growth was the most broadly shared. You're the economist, so you can tweak my, my history here. But from between 1945 and roughly 1975, we asked the wealthy to pay their fair share. America grew faster, and the prosperity was widely distributed. Now, of course, that was for a lot of different reasons. However, you know, the basic economic idea that if you're going to provide stimulus, what you should do is provide it to the people who are going to spend the money. And so in doing that, it'll cause the economy to grow. A Roosevelt Institute report that came out a year ago looked at more or less what would happen if you provided Americans with a guaranteed income roughly of this size, and they found over an 8 to 10 year period, it could add nearly a point to GDP growth per year. That's a huge amount in an environment where we're only growing at 2.5%. It's a huge amount. Now, it is based on a Keynesian model where consumer spending causes the economy to grow, but there's plenty of historical evidence to show that that is, and contemporary evidence to show that that is a defensible idea. So not only do I think that it wouldn't be a tax on the economy. Listen, a lot of economists disagree with me, and I'm sure that there are some tonight. So please stand up. We can debate. It'll be fun. Not only do I believe would it not be a tax on the economy, I think in the long term it's the kind of America that I want to live in, and I think it could be a good thing for our economy. Over the long run.
Okay, so I think we're coming to a close, and I am supposed to ask the last question, and so we should keep it short because we're running out of time. But the question I'm going to ask is, so most of the work you're doing right now is very much focused on advocating for and testing the idea of a basic income. Let's say, the political will for that doesn't happen. What do you think is the next best policy? What would you advocate next, or is there nothing else on the horizon for you?
Any kind of EITC expansion, I think, is it's been popular historically on the left and the right, and we know it works. So it's not exactly the Platonic ideal, but I think it can make a real dent. I will say that I do think there are a lot of other policies, like a child allowance, a child tax credit. Co-determination, all kinds of things that we should do to empower labor unions. I got a long list of policies that I think would be helpful, many of which are not related to a guaranteed income, but I think we need a collection of it. in tandem to really challenge the existing neoliberal economic framework.
Great.
Well, I guess I struggle with the question a little bit because at the same time, we're doing basic income, we're making like college tuition free. We're advocating for more affordable health care, if not free health care. So I think all the policies I want to see, I'm advocating for currently, right now. But I would say, as someone who comes from poverty, this is more than just an intellectual exercise or something I learned about when Mark Zuckerberg gave his graduation speech here. It's something that's visceral and inherently personal. So whether it's this policy or some other, I know for the next 50 plus years, I'll be focused on figuring out how do we change the opportunity structure in this country so it actually rewards work and hard work. Number one, and number two, how do we get rid of poverty? Like, I just think poverty is antiquated. I think Dr. King called it barbaric. And I tend to agree. So whether it's a basic income or whether it's the bevy of other policy solutions, I know I will continue to advocate to make sure that 50 years from now we don't have children growing up in poverty in this country.
Great. Well, thank you both for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.